Dresden First Baptist Church Truth Seekers Sunday School class, one of our adult classes here. It's good to have Kathy Simmons back with us, one of our class members who is a Yankee and goes back up north on a pilgrimage every summer to be with her sister on an island, deserted island, and near Mackinac, I think. And then it's good to have Tommy and Karen back. Puerto Rico again, but also Waverly, both places. So thank y'all for your work there and in both places. What happened in Puerto Rico? What was going on there?
The town we were in, they had a police academy, and while Sin Relief was rebuilding the seminary, they allowed them to work out of the police academy. So in the process, one of the things we had to do was paint the police academy when they left. So we painted outside.
That was up there closer to
it was
San Juan.
No, about 20 minutes south.
Guanaba, which is where Revis's, gets their snap front men's boxer shorts. Is that Guanaba? You've got some, and thank you for that. Not the part about the boxer shorts, but the report.
But Waverly is really on. They're wanting the Baptist church there, Jill, the pastor Scott. I'm sorry. Is wanting churches to take over families. In other words, adopt a family, and they just got nothing. So anybody wants to spend supplies, please send cash. Cash
is what I have a friend or two up there who has shared with me that cash is more important than anything.
We've got a bunch of supplies today.
Because the supplies, you're handing supplies to somebody that has nowhere to take them.
Nowhere to go.
They have no home, they have no place to stay, and you give them a bunch of toilet paper and water, they're carrying it to a hotel room somewhere.
I don't know how many people were put out of the house, but they were put out with their clothes on their back.
Right.
They from the time they saw the water coming, they had 10 seconds to go through.
Right. So it's a tragedy in our midst on Waverly, and there are a lot of people from here going up there, different groups and types of groups that are going up. So there is a volunteer effort, but if you want to help, send money, and one of the places would be First Baptist Waverly.
Is that Karen and Phil took a little over $3,000 up, and that's what Phil decided to do. So people just maybe give it to the association.
Weekly County Baptist Association. You could take the money there, and they will make sure it gets there. Okay, that's another thought. So we'll.
Did you care to the church First Baptist? Yeah, there. Yeah.
The pastor Scott Brown.
He distributed it out.
So we're finishing our last lesson on serving God outside our comfort zones and looking at that concept through the life of Elijah, the great prophet of Judah and Israel. And this week we are looking at the title. The lesson is Lead Others to Serve. Lead Others to Serve. And, we are talking about two avenues of service outside of this church just now with Puerto Rico and with Waverly. And even though you may never have gone on any type mission trip before or been involved in one, these would be two ways to get involved outside your comfort zone and pray to see if God is leading you to do that. The point, yes.
I'm just still learning about the military operation in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Just need to pray.
And we also need to pray for the military that are still in Afghanistan, and hopefully, we need to pray that they all get out that are left there and get out without any further bloodshed or any further loss of life. And so prayers for the military there are in order. I asked James Washburn last night. I saw him at the football game, and he had been stationed there, wounded there, and I asked him if he knew any of the people that were stationed there. And as young as James is, he says, they're all younger than me. These are new guys, and he said, so if you look at the ages of many of those that were killed, just almost out of high school age, 20 and younger, some, and so it's these are the faces and the people who are protecting us and our country and on mission for us.
And I also say that Emily is within like a phone call being called over there to be on those planes, getting the people out, because the people that get on the planes, some of them are about to have a baby and all this stuff. So pray for her that she's not called up and she's not young.
Or even that she's not needed. Let's hope that she's not needed.
She was the head of the whole base squadron as far as the Air Force flight nurses, and she could be called up any minute to go in there.
I wondered about that and thought about it. But anyhow, there's much to pray for. We have a resurgence of the virus in our area, and we're trying to figure out how to operate within that safely for the everything we all do. We're trying to operate safely in that, and really even learn how to live with it, because I don't think it goes away, even with any precautions that we take. It's going to be with us like other viruses, and we're just all going to have to be safe and think of ourselves and others, and pray for God's guidance and direction in that. And we have put one program of our church on hold, but it's just on hold. We're planning to start it back up as soon as we think that's safe, and so at this point not doing anything else. We're still in full operation as far as other things within our church. The focal passage this morning is 1 Kings 19, verses 19 through 21, and 2 Kings, the 2nd chapter, 6th verse through the 14th verse. And the point is that we are to lead others to serve God. We found out over the past several weeks that every part of Elijah's ministry, his time that he served God, was outside anybody's comfort zone. For sure his, but anybody that would have been in that situation. His ministry was a roller coaster of highs and lows, and he was a person who was called to serve God. Our preacher talked about a part of this passage last Wednesday night, and I think he said that Elijah, as far as theologians are concerned, is a type of Christ himself and his suffering. Wayne is nodding, so I think that's accurate. That even in his personality, parts of his personality and his service, he was an itinerant wanderer. He didn't appear to own any property. It doesn't talk about a family or a wife. So he was a man that was called to serve God, and he did that. He was lonely in it. He was in despair. He was rejected by others, especially by his own government, rejected, and he had a bounty on his head. He was subject to arrest and execution and imprisonment. He was deprived. He was preaching a message that was not accepted, and it was not popular by the government or popular in the culture in which he preached. He spoke against the sin and immorality of the nation, and in the presence of the king and queen, against them and their immorality and their pagan worship, and He was a person who battled against sin and against Satan and against the pagan prophets that were the more prevalent of the religious leaders of that country. But on the other hand, he experienced great victory, but he suffered severe despair. So it was a roller coaster for Elijah. And he prophesied and preached in the presence and to kings and queens in their courts, in the palaces. He spoke to throngs of people in his sermons, but and then took part in miraculous demonstrations of the power of God and of his faith. But he spent time in hiding. He spent time in the wilderness. He cowered in defeat and searched for the meaning of his life and his ministry. So an interesting person for us to study. And in our final look at this, his ministry, his time as a prophet was coming to a close, coming to an end. We left him last week at Mount Sinai at Horeb. And it was there that he was in despair, but God came to him and showed his presence to him and explained to him that he wasn't alone, that there would be 7,000 people as a remnant that did not bow their knee to Baal. And so he was in the middle of a bunch of people, not the majority of people, but with several. And even at his age and at that time in his ministry when he thought everything was finished and over, God said, I've got more for you to do. And he had to go back, and he said, get up and go back and return. He did that, and that's where we find him today. He was to anoint 2 kings on his way back. But the third thing he was supposed to do as he went back was to look up and find a man named Elisha. And he was to put his mantle on Elisha, and he was to select him as his successor. And I think included in that would be the understanding that he was to train him to take his place. And that's where we are in the lesson today when it says we are to lead others to serve. It would be ridiculous for us as at our age, serving God here at this church, to not be discipling and training people to take our place. If we do, there'll be a generation that will be raised up who don't know God and are not able to serve and not ready to serve. So we've got to train others. And so here we see the final task of Elijah, the end of his ministry and the shifting of the mantle to Elisha, and see that God is sovereign in his plan, God is sovereign in his work, and his plan continues from generation to generation. And throughout the scriptures and throughout history of the church and of this world, God's servants have come and gone from generation to generation. And we stand on some pretty tall shoulders ourselves, and God's purpose remains. And he tells us, I think, in the Bible, but here in this story of Elijah, that God has work for every generation to do. And we have to disciple and teach and train others to continue that work of the kingdom of God. And Elijah had work to do. He had men to anoint and a man to train to take his place. So that's where we are in 1 Kings chapter 19, looking at verse 19 through 21. Elijah left there and found Elisha, son of Shaphat, as he was plowing. 12 teams of oxen were in front of him, and he was with the 12th team. Elijah walked by him and threw his mantle over him. Elijah left the oxen, ran to follow Elijah, and said, "Please let me kiss my father and mother, and then I will follow you." "Go on back," he replied, "for what have I done to you?" So he turned back from following him, took the team of oxen and slaughtered them. With the oxen's wooden yoke and plow, he cooked the meat, gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he left, followed Elijah, and served him. Well, I don't remember, y'all correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't remember in any of the lessons that we've studied, in any of the assignments that God gave Elijah, that Elijah questioned God in any of the orders that he received. They were interesting orders, He just went and did them. Now, he wasn't perfect because he was in despair at times and depressed and coward after the fact and ran from the judgment of Jezebel. He ran from her and hid out and cowered. But I never remember him questioning God, and he doesn't here that I see. He got up and he went and started this task that God had for him, which required him to go back into the fray, go back toward his arch enemy. He had to go back toward Ahab and Jezebel, not away from them. And so he goes back to them, and without argument, and he tracked down this man named Elisha. Now, often in the scriptures, we wonder at the front end of the stories, which are all now very familiar to us, about God's selection of some of these people. Surely there was somebody better than Elisha for this job, as far as qualifications, a better resume than Elisha, one that might be more amenable to that task on the front end of it. You would think Elijah might have gone to one of the two seminaries or colleges he had started. He started one in Bethel and started one in Jericho, because he goes back to visit them to see the prophets that were in training there. He had some in training already. Why not pick one of them? Go to the seminary. Go to the synagogue. Go to some place where it appears that there's somebody already getting ready for it. But instead, God tells him to go get this farmer to be the next prophet. Now, he was more than just a regular farmer of that day. He had 12 yoke of oxen. Now, I don't know how that compares to tractors, but if he had 12 tractors, it'd be a big operation, And I think that's the kind of thing that's being described, is either the owner himself of a large farm with a lot of equipment that was set for life. He either owned it himself and was the owner-operator, or he was the heir of it. He does have to go back and mention what's going on to his parents, so they're still alive, it appears. So he may have just been the heir, but I believe he was in charge. He was the foreman of the operation, and his life was set. And he would have been, and was, at that moment, wealthy and set. And so here he is. He's out plowing when Elijah walks up to him and takes the mantle off of himself and puts the mantle on Elisha while Elisha is plowing. And there was no other introduction. But apparently that mantle was something that everybody knew what it was that was Jewish, or Elisha had seen Elijah and already knew who he was, or the Spirit of God spoke to him. And that became clear to him without any further explanation in the scriptures. When that mantle came on him, he understood what was being done and what it meant. And it appears that without any hesitation, he accepted the job and accepted the appointment and the commission and the call of God. Because it said, Elisha left the oxen, ran to follow Elijah, is the first thing he did. Apparently, Elijah put the mantle on him and walked off without even saying anything to him. And he leaves the oxen and runs after him and says, I'm following you. I'm accepting it. And now 2 or 3 things that are apparent, I think, as you read this. It would be that he's wealthy, that he is the foreman of a crew, and there are 11 other oxen teams in front of him with men with plows behind them that are under his orders and direction. But he is a servant leader of those men, because I'm sure he could have hired a 12th person to do it, but he chose to do it himself. Here is a farmer, an owner, a foreman who's working alongside the rest of the crew to show them what he's wanting to be done. He's showing them how to do the job he's asked them to do. He's working alongside, which is the best form of leadership, I think, anywhere. And also his acceptance of this job without hesitation says something about his spiritual life, his purity, his holiness, and his readiness to serve God. He was ready for the job. Apparently, he would have been ready to do anything God called him to do. He was the man that should be called because he was prepared and he was ready. And here's a man who was invested, a man who was ambitious, and very involved in a secular career. And in a family that had wealth, and a man who had it made, and he was set for life and comfortable in that role. And God was calling him, just like he had called Elijah, to leave his comfort zone. His comfort zone was where he was, plowing in a field. That's where he was comfortable. That's what he was used to in the role he was in. But God placed him at a crossroad, and the same thing happens to us when God calls us to do anything. He puts us at that same crossroad, and we have to decide how we're going to handle that and how we're going to respond to that question. And it's found throughout the scriptures. This same question is asked of, I don't know if it's hundreds, but a lot of people are asked this question in the scriptures. And some respond verbally and then don't respond physically to it. But there are some who don't respond verbally but do respond physically to the call. And so a term with which I'm familiar, the jury is out on our response when God calls. What we're going to say and what we're going to do, okay? One of Wayne's expressions to me has always been when a person passes away that we're talking about, did they finish right? You know, there's a lot of people that start well and don't finish right. But there's a lot of people that start bad and finish right. In the Christian life, it's how you finish. It's what you do after the call that makes the difference. It's what you do then. And you know what's interesting? You know, Tommy and Karen, for instance, sitting right here in this room. there was a woman and her husband that were very important to my mother, and then because of that to our family. When my mother went to college at Union, she didn't have nothing. When my daddy went, he had nothing. Didn't finish until after the war when he had the GI Bill, okay? But would have had nothing but that, you know. But my mother, I worked it out down there on work study, that kind of thing at Union. And they put her under the kind of the custody of Dr. Lewis Matthews and his wife Rika, who had been missionaries in Argentina. and so then they became professors. And anyhow, my mother was sort of their nanny, or housekeeper. She cooked their meals, washed their clothes, got their kids ready for school, and did that kind of thing. And in turn, the Matthews helped her through school. And so they became very important. But Ms. Matthews, when her husband died, she had been a missionary to Argentina, then became a professor in Christian schools, and then when her husband died, she joined the Peace Corps. That's what she did. And after she retired from the Peace Corps in her 80s, I remember I was watching the news one night at my mom and daddy's house, and they had a remote control at 3 channels. You know, and it was a real odd remote control, but you could sure enough change from one to another. You could go from ABC to CBS to NBC, and maybe a PBS station that was kind of clouded. And but anyhow, I remember one night there was one of those, you know, breaking news. Now today, everything's breaking news. You know, and if everything's breaking news, nothing's breaking news, if you follow what I'm saying. But back then, when they said breaking news, something had happened, you know, and something had happened that you need to pay attention to because it was something, okay? And that night, it was an earthquake in Honduras. And many people had lost their life. And they started talking about it. And I found it interesting that there was an earthquake. I found it shocking that people had lost their lives. But after that, I changed the channel, okay? That was my response. Now, I was just in high school. But my response was to change the channel. We got a phone call within minutes of that, where Mother Matthews, we called her, Rika, called my mama to tell her she was going to be out of the country for a few weeks. And my mother said, "Why? Where are you going? You're in your 80s. She said, "I'm going to Honduras because there's an earthquake there and they may need me." That was her response to the earthquake. So we get the call of God. Maybe it's in a breaking news story. I don't know. But the response is ours, you know. And so the response is what's important. And you know, it's interesting that this response seems to be just like the response of the rich young ruler guy that was talking to Jesus. Jesus called him to follow him. And he says, "Let me go back and bury my parents. Let me go back and take care of something." It's the same statement. And so Jesus, of course, understood what that person meant because Jesus is God. And he read the mind and the heart of that person. But Elijah didn't know. Elijah's not God. And he says to Elijah, Elisha does, after running after him now and saying, "I'm going to follow you," he says, "Let me go back and kiss my father and mother, and then I'll be back." And it's an interesting response to me from Elijah. He says, "Why, sure, go back. What I've asked you to do here is phenomenal. What I've asked you to do, this mantle I've placed on you is incredible. And if I'm calling on you to leave everything, sure, I don't, you need to go think about it. Think about it. Go think about it." And then the jury's out. To a human commissioning somebody else to do something, to a human that has done that, the jury's out. You don't know what that person's going to do. Elijah didn't know what Elisha was going to do. His only job was to commission him, hand his mantle to him, and then let God convict his heart. And then see. Sure, I understand the thing I'm asking you. Sure, go back and find out what you want to do. And Elijah kind of acquiesces. Sure, go ahead. Go finish up your affairs. Go take care of what you need to take care of. Because this calls for a total sellout. It calls for it. And it would be something uncommon, extraordinary for him to sell out, wouldn't it? It would be, incredible to find somebody in our world to do that. I think an example of it is Eduardo Garcia in Honduras at the Nazareth Baptist Church, who was a successful businessman. The church was without a pastor, and they were without a pastor for some period of time. And he filled in, for them. But finally the church and God called him to leave his job and become a pastor. And he did. And he left his career to do that. God certainly has not blessed him financially in that call. If you've ever been to his house, and see the vehicle he drives, God hadn't blessed him financially, but he's blessed him. And he is a great man and servant of God, but God hadn't blessed him financially and materially. Blessed him in many other ways and phenomenally blessed him. But how is Elisha going to respond? And what he does is he burns all of his bridges, so he can't go back. He goes out and destroys his wealth. He kills 24 cows, 24 oxen, kills them, cooks them, and the fire was made by the plows that they were using, the wood from the plows. That's what they cooked them over. So that once he gave that food to his friends and his family and his neighbors and the poor, he had nothing left. He showed his parents and he showed the world that he sold out to God. That's what he told them. He burned the bridges that he had. He sacrificed his influence. He sacrificed his position to become what initially? He understood what it was. He understood. But it explains it in the last sentence. Then he left, followed Elijah, and served him. Here is a man with servants serving him, who became a servant. He was the servant of Elijah, was his job. He burned every remnant of his past life and left it all to follow God. This teaches us that wealth, material wealth, is unimportant. It's unimportant to God unless we're using it to serve him. Unless we're using it to help others, it means nothing to God for us. So let's look at the second part. We're now only in the second part and only have a little while. Chapter 2 of 2 Kings, the 6th verse, the 6th through the 11th verses. Elijah said to him, "Stay here, the Lord is sending me to the Jordan." But Elisha said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men from the sons of the prophets came and stood, observing them at a distance, while the two of them stood by the Jordan. Elijah took his mantle, rolled it up, and struck the water with it. which parted to the right and left. Then the two of them crossed over on dry ground. When they had crossed over, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me, what can I do for you before I am taken from you?" So Elisha answered, "Please let me inherit 2 shares of your spirit." Elijah replied, "You have asked for something difficult. If you see me being taken from you, you will have it. If not, you won't." And they continued walking and talking, and a chariot of fire with horses of fire suddenly appeared and separated the two of them. Then Elijah went up into heaven in the whirlwind. Famous to us, but mostly for this last part of it. Because we know that Elijah was taken off in a chariot of fire. It's what they write the song about. "Swing low, sweet chariot, come and let me ride." We'd like to ride in a chariot of fire up into heaven, wouldn't we, and not die. Elijah's only one of 2 that didn't ever die. Jesus died, and had to experience death. Elijah didn't experience death. He was taken away in a chariot of fire in the presence of Elisha. And Enoch just walked with the Lord into heaven. They just got to talking, and he just walked on in to heaven with God. 2 great men of the scriptures who were so close to God that he chose not to have them die, which would be incredible. But anyhow, maybe not the greatest miracle. Here is Elijah and Elisha wandering around the country on Elijah's farewell tour. He was going to places he'd been before and seeing the people and encouraging others to continue in the ministry, showing Elisha where he had friends and where he can go and what he's to do, demonstrating miracles of God and the things that God might allow him to do as well, if God gave him that spirit. And they went to the 2 seminaries that he had founded, Jericho and at Bethel. And these 50 men, I think, were 50 of his pupils, really, prophets in waiting, that were standing by at a distance, knowing that this was a time the 2 of them needed to be together and to share together. And so they're talking, and they get to the Jordan River, and those 50 men, watch this. Those 50 men saw what happened at that point. I don't know how many times it had happened before. This is the only time it was recorded, He rolls up this mantle of cloth, I guess, and it hits the water with it, and the Jordan parted. And the 2 of them walked across on dry ground. What an amazing miracle to observe. And Elisha is in awe of that. He had to have been. And if he's walking on dry ground along with Elijah, and then to see what a great servant of God he was and how close he was to God. For something like that to happen. And he's called me to be that. I don't have that power, And Elijah says, what would you want? And he knew Elijah had nothing to give him materially. What would you want me to give you if I could give you something? And an elder son, the oldest son, always got a double portion by law of the father's estate. And so that's where I think this came from in his thought process. But he says, I would like to have from you a double portion of your spirit. That's what I'd like to have. I'd like to be that close to God. I'd like to just get a double portion of your spirit. And that's something Elijah couldn't give. He said, that's difficult because I can't give it. Only God can give that to you. Now, if you see me as I depart, if God allows you to see it, then you'll know you've got it. You've got that wish granted, that gift granted. And sure enough, he sees it. The chariot come and pick him up and take him away, translate him into heaven. And what does he do? I think this is remarkable because there's the mantle that's fallen down. And there's the mantle, and he picks it up and accepts the call of God. When he's by himself, he accepts the call of God. And he wrapped that mantle up And he went to the Jordan and he hit that water and it parted. And he walked across on dry land to those 50 men that had been watching it. And those 50 men may not have seen Elijah leave, but they saw Elisha part the waters, didn't they? Which is an amazing thing. And it says, as Elisha watched, he kept crying out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And when he could see him no longer, he took hold of his own clothes, tore them in two, picked up the mantle that had fallen off of Elijah, and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. So, he says, he took the mantle, struck the water. Where is the Lord God of Elijah? He asked. He struck the water himself, and it parted to the right and to the left, and Elisha crossed over. So, God blessed the decision of Elisha. He saw it. He watched his decision. He saw him pick up the mantle. He was trained for it. And God is faithful from generation to generation. In Psalm 100, which is one of the Psalms I've memorized, he said, bless the Lord. He is good. Be thankful to him. He's good. His mercy is everlasting, and his truth endureth from generation to generation, to all generations. God doesn't disappoint. He picks up, if we pick up the mantle and choose to serve, God will bless the decision. God can still part the Jordan and do miracles. God's power is still omnipotent. We must remember that God does not promise a rose garden. He actually promises the opposite. He warns us that the life of service to him will be difficult and take us completely outside our comfort zones. If you don't want to get outside your comfort zone, don't pick up the mantle. Don't pick it up, because he's going to take you outside the comfort zone. But you'll never be blessed the way God can bless you unless you pick up the mantle, unless you serve him. A life dedicated to God will require sacrifice and courage, perhaps misery and suffering. And the Bible is replete with examples for us to see. We stand warned. But there's one thing that we got to remember, I think, in the life of Elijah and Elisha. God didn't save Elijah because of his service to him. Y'all get that? He didn't save Elisha because he picked up the mantle of service. He saved them because of their faith in him and their belief in him, and by his grace and his mercy. That's the only reason he saved Elijah, the only reason he saved Elisha, not because of their work. But he called them to work, okay? He called them to service. He called them to a mission, and they accepted it. No life is more blessed by God than a life spent in service for him. And we are called, each of us, to serve God, and we're called to prepare others to serve as well. So a wonderful study in the life of Elijah, and I have been blessed by it. I hope y'all have. Let's have a closing word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the day and your blessings. Thank you for your word. Lord, help us to delight in your word and your law. Help us to delight in it day and night. Help us to read it and study it, and help us to respond to it. And Lord, call us to service. Give us opportunities to serve that are outside our comfort zones, and give us the courage and boldness to accept the mantle that you place on us, and give us the opportunities to serve. Help us to be faithful to you in accepting that, And help us to be willing to step outside our comfort zones into the face of the devil himself, if you call us, and help us to be soldiers of the cross. Help us to share our faith with others. Help us to evangelize. Help us to tell other people what you've done for us. Thank you for saving us, for your love, for your mercy and your grace, Lord, to people who don't deserve it. Me, the chiefest. So forgive me, Lord, of my sins. Be with us. Thank you for the study of Elijah. Thank you for his life and his example. Thank you for his disciple and student Elisha, and for what he did by accepting the mantle that you placed on him. Forgive us for our sins, Lord. Help us as we worship you today. You're worthy of our worship. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.